a WikiVidi documentaries production. Don't forget to like and subscribe. Enjoy. Vietnam. Vietnam, officially the Socialist Republic of Vietnam, is the easternmost country on the Indochina Peninsula in Southeast Asia. With an estimated million inhabitants, it is the world's 14th most populous country, and the 9th most populous Asian country. Vietnam is bordered by China to the north, Laos to the northwest, Cambodia to the southwest, Thailand across the Gulf of Thailand to the southwest, and the Philippines, Malaysia and Indonesia across the South China Sea to the east and southeast. Its capital city has been Hanoi since the reunification of North and South Vietnam in 1976, with Ho Chi Minh City as the most populous city. The northern part of Vietnam was part of Imperial China for over a millennium, from 111 BC to AD 939. An independent Vietnamese state was formed in 939. Following a Vietnamese victory in the Battle of Bạch Đằng River, successive Vietnamese imperial dynasties flourished as the nation expanded geographically and politically into Southeast Asia, until the Indochina Peninsula was colonized by the French in the mid-19th century. Following a Japanese occupation in the 1940s, the Vietnamese fought French rule in the First Indochina War, eventually expelling the French in 1954. Thereafter, Vietnam was divided politically into two rival states, North Vietnam and South Vietnam. Conflict between the two sides intensified in what is known as the Vietnam War, with heavy intervention by the United States on the side of South Vietnam from 1965 to 1973. The war ended with a North Vietnamese victory in 1975. Vietnam was then unified under a Marxist-Leninist government, but remained impoverished and politically isolated. In 1986, the government initiated a series of economic and political reforms which began Vietnam's path towards integration into the world economy. By 2000, it had established diplomatic relations with all nations. Since 2000, Vietnam's economic growth rate has been among the highest in the world, and, in 2011, it had the highest global growth generators index among 11 major economies. Its successful economic reforms resulted in its joining the World Trade Organization in 2007. It is also a member of the Asia-Pacific Economic Cooperation and the Organisation Internationale de la Francophonie. Etymology. The name is a variation of a name that can be traced back to the True dynasty of the 2nd century BC. The word Viet originated as a shortened form of Bach Viet, a group of people then living in southern China and Vietnam. The form, Vietnam, is first recorded in the 16th century oracular poem Sam Trang Trin. The name has also been found on 12 steles carved in the 16th and 17th centuries, including one at Bao Lam Pagoda in Haiphong that dates to 1558. In 1802, Nguyen Phu Khan established the Nguyen dynasty, and in the second year, he asked the Qing Emperor Jiaqing to confer him the title King of Nam Viet/Nam Nhu, but the Grand Secretariat of Qing dynasty pointed out that the name Nam Viet/Nam Nhu includes regions of Guangxi and Guangdong in China, and Nguyen Phu Khan only has Annam, which is simply the area of our old Jiaozi. How can they be called Nam Viet/Nam Nhu? Then, as recorded, rewarded Yunnan/Vietnam as their nation's name, to also show that they are below the region of Bayu/Bach Viet. Between 1804 and 1813, the name was used officially by Emperor Jialong. It was revived in the early 20th century by Phan Boi Chau's History of the Loss of Vietnam, and later by the Vietnamese Nationalist Party. The country was usually called Annam until 1945, when both the imperial government in Hue and the Viet Minh government in Hanoi adopted. Prehistory. Archaeological excavations have revealed the existence of humans in what is now Vietnam as early as the Paleolithic age. Homo erectus fossils dating to around 500,000 BC have been found in caves in Lang Son and Nay provinces in northern Vietnam. The oldest Homo sapiens fossils from mainland Southeast Asia are of Middle Pleistocene provenance, and include isolated tooth fragments from Tam Um and Hang Hum. Teeth attributed to Homo sapiens from the late Pleistocene have also been found at Dong Can, and from the early Holocene at My Da Dieu, Lang Gao, and Lang Kum. By about 1000 BC, the development of wet rice cultivation and bronze casting in the Ma River and Red River floodplains led to the flourishing of the Dong Sun culture, notable for its elaborate bronze Dong Sun drums. At this time, the early Vietnamese kingdoms of Van Lang and O Lac appeared, and the culture's influence spread to other parts of Southeast Asia, including maritime Southeast Asia, throughout the first millennium BC. Dynastic Vietnam. The Hong Bang dynasty of the Hung kings is considered the first Vietnamese state, known in Vietnamese as Van Lang. In 257 BC, the last Hung king was defeated by Tuc Phan, who consolidated the Lac Viet and O Viet tribes to form the O Lac, proclaiming himself and Duong Vuong. In 207 BC, a Chinese general named Zhao Tuo defeated and Duong Vuong and consolidated O Lac into Nanu. However, Nanu was itself incorporated into the empire of the Chinese Han dynasty in 111 BC after the Han-Nanu War. For the next 1,000 years, what is now northern Vietnam remained mostly under Chinese rule. Early independence movements, such as those of the Trung sisters and Lady True, were only temporarily successful, though the region gained a longer period of independence as Van Chuan under the anterior Li dynasty between AD 544 and 602. By the early 10th century, Vietnam had gained autonomy, but not sovereignty, under the Cook family. In AD 938, the Vietnamese Lord O Huyen defeated the forces of the Chinese Southern Han state at Bac Dang River and achieved full independence for Vietnam after a millennium of Chinese domination. Renamed as Di Viet, the nation enjoyed a golden era under the Li and Tran dynasties. During the rule of the Tran dynasty, Di Viet repelled 3 Mongol invasions. Meanwhile, Buddhism flourished and became the state religion, following the 1406-7 Ming-Ho War which overthrew the Ho dynasty. Vietnamese independence was briefly interrupted by the Chinese Ming dynasty, but was restored by Le Loi, the founder of the Le dynasty. The Vietnamese dynasties reached their zenith in the Le dynasty of the 15th century, especially during the reign of Emperor Le Thanh Tong. Between the 11th and 18th centuries, Vietnam expanded southward in a process known as, eventually conquering the Kingdom of Champa and part of the Khmer Empire. From the 16th century onwards, civil strife and frequent political infighting engulfed much of Vietnam. First, the Chinese-supported Mac dynasty challenged the Le dynasty's power. After the Mac dynasty was defeated, the Le dynasty was nominally reinstalled, but actual power was divided between the northern Trin lords and the southern Nguyen lords, who engaged in a civil war for more than 4 decades before a truce was called in the 1670s. During this time, the Nguyen expanded southern Vietnam into the Mekong Delta, annexing the Central Highlands and the Khmer lands in the Mekong Delta. The division of the country ended a century later when the Tay Son brothers established a new dynasty. However, their rule did not last long, and they were defeated by the remnants of the Nguyen lords, led by Nguyen An and aided by the French. Nguyen An unified Vietnam and established the Nguyen dynasty, ruling under the name Gia Long. French Indochina. Vietnam's independence was gradually eroded by France, aided by large Catholic militias in a series of military conquests between 1859 and 1885. In 1862, the southern third of the country became the French colony of Cochinchina. By 1884, the entire country had come under French rule, with the central and northern parts of Vietnam separated in the 2 protectorates of Annam and Tonkin. The 3 Vietnamese entities were formally integrated into the Union of French Indochina in 1887. The French administration imposed significant political and cultural changes on Vietnamese society. A Western-style system of modern education was developed, and Roman Catholicism was propagated widely. Most French settlers in Indochina were concentrated in Cochinchina, particularly in the region of Saigon. The royalist Can Vuong movement rebelled against French rule and was defeated in the 1890s after a decade of resistance. Guerrillas of the Can Vuong movement murdered around a third of Vietnam's Christian population during this period. Developing a plantation economy to promote the export of tobacco, indigo, tea and coffee, the French largely ignored increasing calls for Vietnamese self-government and civil rights. A nationalist political movement soon emerged, with leaders such as Phan Boi Chau, Phan Chu Trinh, Phan Dinh Phung, Emperor Ham Nay and Ho Chi Minh fighting or calling for independence. However, The 1930 Yen-Bai mutiny of the Vietnam Quoc Dan Dang was suppressed easily. The French maintained full control of their colonies until World War II, when the war in the Pacific led to the Japanese invasion of French Indochina in 1940. Afterwards, the Japanese Empire was allowed to station its troops in Vietnam while permitting the pro-Vichy French colonial administration to continue. Japan exploited Vietnam's natural resources to support its military campaigns, culminating in the full-scale takeover of the country in March 1945, and the Vietnamese famine of 1945, which caused up to 2 million deaths. First Indochina War. In 1941, the Viet Minh, a communist and nationalist liberation movement, emerged under the Vietnamese revolutionary leader Ho Chi Minh, who sought independence for Vietnam from France and the end of the Japanese occupation. Following the military defeat of Japan and the fall of its puppet empire of Vietnam in August 1945, the Viet Minh occupied Hanoi and proclaimed a provisional government, which asserted national independence on the 2nd of September. In the same year, the Provisional Government of the French Republic sent the French Far East Expeditionary Corps to restore colonial rule, and the Viet Minh began a guerrilla campaign against the French in late 1946. The resulting First Indochina War lasted until July 1954. The defeat of French and Vietnamese loyalists in the 1954 Battle of Dien Bien Phu allowed Ho Chi Minh to negotiate a ceasefire from a favorable position at the subsequent Geneva Conference. The colonial administration was ended, and French Indochina was dissolved under the Geneva Accords of 1954 into 3 countries, Vietnam and the kingdoms of Cambodia and Laos. Vietnam was further divided into North and South administrative regions at the Vietnamese Demilitarized Zone, approximately along the 17th parallel north, pending elections scheduled for July 1956. A 300-day period of free movement was permitted, during which almost 1 million Northerners, mainly Catholics, moved south, fearing persecution by the Communists. The partition of Vietnam was not intended to be permanent by the Geneva Accords, which stipulated that Vietnam would be reunited after elections in 1956. However, in 1955, the state of Vietnam's Prime Minister, Ngo Dinh Diem, toppled Bao Dai in a fraudulent referendum organized by his brother Ngo Dinh Nhu, and proclaimed himself President of the Republic of Vietnam. At that point, the internationally recognized state of Vietnam effectively ceased to exist and was replaced by the Republic of Vietnam in the south, and Ho Chi Minh's Democratic Republic of Vietnam in the north. Vietnam War. The pro-Hanoi Viet Cong began a guerrilla campaign in the late 1950s to overthrow Diem's government. Between 1953 and 1956, the North Vietnamese government instituted various agrarian reforms, including rent reduction and land reform, which resulted in significant political oppression. During the land reform, testimony from North Vietnamese witnesses suggested a ratio of 1 execution for every 160 village residents, which extrapolated nationwide would indicate nearly 100,000 executions. Because the campaign was concentrated mainly in the Red River Delta area, a lower estimate of 50,000 executions became widely accepted by scholars at the time. However, declassified documents from the Vietnamese and Hungarian archives indicate that the number of executions was much lower than reported at the time, although likely greater than 13,500. In the south, Diem countered North Vietnamese subversion by detaining tens of thousands of suspected communists in political re-education centers. This was a ruthless program that incarcerated many non-communists, although it was also successful at curtailing communist activity in the country, if only for a time. The North Vietnamese government claimed that 2,148 individuals were killed in the process by November 1957. In 1960 and 1962, the Soviet Union and North Vietnam signed treaties providing for further Soviet military support. In 1963, Buddhist discontent with Diem's regime erupted into mass demonstrations, leading to a violent government crackdown. This led to the collapse of Diem's relationship with the United States, and ultimately to the 1963 coup in which Diem and Nhu were assassinated. The Diem era was followed by more than a dozen successive military governments, before the pairing of Air Marshal Win Cao Ky and General Win Van Thieu took control in mid-1965. Thieu gradually outmaneuvered Gay and cemented his grip on power in fraudulent elections in 1967 and 1971. Under this political instability, the Communists began to gain ground. To support South Vietnam's struggle against the Communist insurgency, the United States began increasing its contribution of military advisors, using the 1964 Tonkin Gulf incident as a pretext for such intervention. U.S. forces became involved in ground combat operations in 1965, and at their peak they numbered more than 500,000. The U.S. also engaged in a sustained aerial bombing campaign. Meanwhile, China and the Soviet Union provided North Vietnam with significant material aid and 15,000 combat advisors. Communist forces supplying the Viet Cong carried supplies along the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which passed through Laos. The Communists attacked South Vietnamese targets during the 1968 Tet Offensive. Although the campaign failed militarily, it shocked the American establishment and turned U.S. public opinion against the war. During the offensive, Communist troops massacred over 3,000 civilians at Hue. Facing an increasing casualty count, rising domestic opposition to the war, and growing international condemnation, the U.S. began withdrawing from ground combat roles in the early 1970s. This process also entailed an unsuccessful effort to strengthen and stabilize South Vietnam. Following the Paris Peace Accords of 27 January 1973, all American combat troops were withdrawn by 29 March 1973. In December 1974, North Vietnam captured the province of Phuoc Long and started a full-scale offensive, culminating in the fall of Saigon on 30 April 1975. South Vietnam was briefly ruled by a provisional government while under military occupation by North Vietnam. On 2 July 1976, North and South Vietnam were merged to form the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. The war left Vietnam devastated, with the total death toll standing at between 966,000 and 3.8 million. Reunification and reforms. In the aftermath of the war, under Le Duan's administration, there were no mass executions of South Vietnamese who had collaborated with the U.S. or the Saigon government, confounding Western fears. However, up to 300,000 South Vietnamese were sent to re-education camps, where many endured torture, starvation, and disease while being forced to perform hard labor. The government embarked on a mass campaign of collectivization of farms and factories. This caused economic chaos and resulted in triple-digit inflation, while national reconstruction efforts progressed slowly. In 1978, the Vietnamese military invaded Cambodia to remove from power the Khmer Rouge, who had been attacking Vietnamese border villages. Vietnam was victorious, installing a government in Cambodia which ruled until 1989. This action worsened relations with the Chinese, who launched a brief incursion into northern Vietnam in 1979. This conflict caused Vietnam to rely even more heavily on Soviet economic and military aid. At the 6th National Congress of the Communist Party of Vietnam in December 1986, reformist politicians replaced the old guard government with new leadership. The reformers were led by 71-year-old Nguyen Van Linh, who became the party's new general secretary. Linh and the reformers implemented a series of free market reforms known as which carefully managed the transition from a planned economy to a socialist-oriented market economy. Though the authority of the state remained unchallenged under Doi Moi, the government encouraged private ownership of farms and factories, economic deregulation and foreign investment, while maintaining control over strategic industries. The Vietnamese economy subsequently achieved strong growth in agricultural and industrial production, construction, exports and foreign investment. These reforms have also caused a rise in income inequality and gender disparities. Politics. The Socialist Republic of Vietnam, along with China, Cuba, and Laos, is one of the world's 4 remaining one-party socialist states officially espousing communism. Its current state constitution, 2013 Constitution, asserts the central role of the Communist Party of Vietnam in all organs of politics and society. The General Secretary of the Communist Party performs numerous key administrative functions, controlling the party's national organization. President performs executive functions and state appointments, as well as setting policy. Only political organizations affiliated with or endorsed by the Communist Party are permitted to contest elections in Vietnam. These include the Vietnamese Fatherland Front and Worker and Trade Unionist parties. Although the state remains officially committed to socialism as its defining creed, its economic policies have grown increasingly capitalist, with The Economist characterizing its leadership as ardently capitalist communists. Brought to you by WikiVidi documentaries. Would you like to know more?